Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to cover the fact that over the last month or so, there's been a number of articles come out about the end of the streaming wars. And while a lot of people have covered the articles, mostly to laugh at simply what is going on, I think that if you pull back, you can see a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the economic picture of how the end of the streaming wars will affect and, to some extent, destroy, quote unquote, woke entertainment. Starting very small, I would say, we see effects of it happening right now within something like the comic industry, but a ripple effect nonetheless that will get bigger and bigger and affect certainly the movie industry and the gaming industry, all the things I usually touch on. And in addition to that, I'm going to, at the end, talk a little bit about why I'm covering this, which is the fact that I think that the replacement for all of this will be heroic type stories. However, if you're looking for heroic stories right now, there are two links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. They are about true, traditional heroism. There are 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 low fantasy sword and sorcery. You're looking at some of the spectacular art from those in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. Okay, so I'm going to go over basically some economic factors first, which is probably going to be a large chunk of this video, although I am painting things most particularly with a broad brush. But I'm sure people in the comments will make sure that if I get anything wrong or they want to make additions to what I have to say, it will be there. So the point is that you have to do something which your quote unquote progressive people can't do in order to see how this entire thing is going to play out. You have to look at history and figure out where this has happened before or similar events before and just extrapolate from that what is going to happen in the future. Progressive people can't do this because they don't think there's such a thing as a fixed human nature, and therefore that constant is not there in order for you to analyze history in that way. But anyway, I would say that there are a number of different and various situations where this exact thing has happened, especially concerning the entertainment industry. The closest to this would be the cable wars of the, I think it was 1990s when the cable wars were on. Quite honestly, the streaming wars is just a rerun of the cable wars. However, I would also include things like the popularity of comics within the 1950s or the meteoric rise of Saturday morning television in the 1980s. And if we want to go much larger, we can simply look at the economic impact of Japan within the 1980s, early 90s, and how a lot of that money that poured into Japan at that time got poured into entertainment. So, long story short, I'm looking at boom and bust situations that concern entertainment or had a massive impact on entertainment. And of those examples that I gave, they all had various ways in which they ended, in which they busted. Quite honestly, I would say, and again, correct me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, that the end of the cable wars was because the cream rose to the top. There was competition, it was merit-based. Yes, I'm sure there was some shenanigans going on in the background, especially since this was a time when everybody trusted the idiot box in the corner. But at the same time, it was the best one out and the rest died out. And when that happened, people stopped pouring money into what they then saw as the future of entertainment. Now, in the case of the popularity of comic books within the 1950s and also the rise of Saturday morning cartoons in the 1980s, both of those busted because basically government control stepped in and said, no, you can't do things by yourself anymore. We have to have a regulatory body that's going to shape how you produce your product. And since the frontier Wild West attitude of that kind of entertainment stopped with the government control, people stopped pouring massive amounts of money into it, at the very least in particular ways, and only did it in very streamlined ways, which we see with comics. The streamline went into superheroes rather than having various kinds of genres all over the place. And of course, with Saturday morning cartoons, it was them stepping in and saying, no, you're doing this to sell toys to children. Perhaps that's not the best way to deal with the minds of children. The government's going to step in and say, this is what you can do, this is what you can't. But again, the point is that the fire hose of money simply dried up, and so there was a bust. But quite honestly, for myself, if I'm thinking of a situation which is a mirror to what is going on with the end of the streaming wars, I would look at the bust of the Japanese economy within the 1990s, and again, how that affected entertainment, even though it is, again, a extremely broad brush that I'm painting with. And I say that because if you don't Remember, what actually happened was the production and economic advancements within Japan at that time, which was the 1980s, made the world stand up and take notice because they were moving in leaps and bounds, and they projected it into the future, saying if they continue to move at this pace, they will be the world leader within 10 to 20 years. And so people started to pour money into Japan, thinking that this was the new place where everything was going to happen. Again, turned on a fire hose of money. A lot of that money went into things like entertainment. That's why you actually have, I would say, so many iconic 1980s and early 90s anime, manga, television shows, etc. But the point is that there was a bust. And that economic bust, which was over 25 years ago now, is still being felt within the economy of Japan today. Many economists have said that they still haven't fully recovered from that bust. And the bust came because everyone was taking their rapid advancement and projecting it again into the future, saying if this continues, but it simply didn't continue. They reached a high point and they couldn't go any further. And for my estimation, and an estimation of many economists, again, is the fact that there were deep-seated cultural norms within Japan which simply got in the way. Although I would say there is a limit to anything, so they simply reached that limit. But it was a limitation, again, placed on the culture by these deep-seated historical norms of how people worked, what companies did in order to keep employees, etc., etc. Now, again, without painting it as good or bad, I simply say it is, and it was tied in with their history, and again, how employers and employees worked together, how they would produce products, and when industry hit that wall of we can't do these things, the meteoric rise simply stopped. People realized this, realized that the economy was faltering, and therefore stopped investing their money there. And that, of course, led to a extreme bust within so many sectors. But again, one of those sectors would be the entertainment industry within Japan itself. Quite honestly, you don't realize how much money was poured into the entertainment sector within Japan within the 80s and 90s, early 90s anyways. People were swimming in money, doing ridiculous things with it. If I remember correctly, there was one entertainment industry that decided to build a, $1 million mechanical Tyrannosaurus Rex outside of its office. Why? Because they had the money to do so. That was it. And I see this as the best parallel to the end of the streaming wars because you have people within the last 10 to 15 years within the streaming wars, and again, going back to when things really started, just turning on a fire hose of money that just got splashed everywhere. But again, there was deep-seated, not cultural beliefs in this case, but political beliefs wherein the industry hit a wall. And as I mentioned, that wall, I think, can be seen in some of the articles that are coming out right now. Not only saying that this is the end of the streaming wars because, well, basically, Netflix has won. It started out on top. It is still on top. Nothing has changed. There might be 2 other streaming services that will survive. The rest are probably going to go the way of the dodo, which again is kind of the norm for American television with Big 3, and that's about it. Secondly, over the last week, there's been articles coming out about the fact that on the streaming services, what people are actually watching are old shows. Those are the top shows within streaming services. It's not these new shows that they're producing. People are watching The Big Bang, or Grey's Anatomy, or Gilmore Girls, or Friends, or Supernatural. These are the top-rated shows on streaming services, not things that they are producing that are new. And thirdly, we're also seeing articles about the cutbacks within the streaming services themselves, which is the effect, most would say, of the Hollywood strike that happened last year. Basically, they're saying that, okay, all these streaming services, we're looking at the demands of the actors and these various other unions, and the services decided to give in to the demands of these unions, and their demands was basically saying, look, these top shows are getting this much money, why don't we as smaller shows get similar amounts of money? And they gave in to those demands because in the back of their mind they said, we'll give in to those demands because we know that within a couple of months, we're basically going to cancel all of you smaller shows. And those people who are doing the big shows, we don't have to give them anything extra because they're already getting that much money. We'll just keep them and you're gone. And that's what we see happening right now. So again, as I said, these are all signs of a contraction, a bust within your streaming wars and the end of the streaming wars. But again, I would contend that the point of this entire thing, why this is going on, is for the most part, because they hit a wall wherein, just like within Japan, there was deep-seated cultural norms that weren't going to change. Instead, they have deep-seated political norms that aren't going to change and that are getting in the way of actual business, and this has caused the bust. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I covered an article a couple of weeks ago talking about how various and really unnamed people were writing letters to entertainment industry news watchers and saying, this is what is wrong with Hollywood, this is what is wrong with television right now. And the basis of what was said over and over again was the fact that a hose of money got turned on with the streaming wars. Everybody saw this as the wave of the future for entertainment. And so money just got poured so fast into streaming services that they couldn't keep up the demand to actually spend it with the amount of people that were working there at the time. Therefore, they had to engage a whole bunch of new people in order to fill positions, and many of these new people were younger people who simply did not understand what was going on. Now again, if we look back at history, when we have such a boom within the entertainment system, yeah, the same thing happens. You get younger people stepping into positions that they're not quite ready for or not trained for, but that brings in with it, or has historically brought in with it, some innovation, some new ideas, and since we're talking about this historically, many of these young people went on to their own meteoric rise. Why? Because they learned from their faults. They learned really quickly how to navigate this system that they had been thrown into. And again, the cream rose to the top. But that's not what happened this time. Why? Because the new people who were shoved into these positions within these streaming services were, I think, woefully unprepared is a gigantic understatement, because they were of a generation of people who are used to everybody gets a trophy, don't hurt anybody's feelings, and instant gratification. Not to mention the fact that most of these people would be in a level of society where that would be laid on thick. But the point is that when they get into what was technically, historically, a merit-based system, they didn't try to fit in and become better and use their small bits of innovation and views into the younger mind to advance and become the new up-and-comers for that industry, again, because they weren't used to anything that was merit-based. It was all everybody gets a trophy because of participation. And so they substituted something else where merit should be, and that was political correctness. And why political correctness? Well, first of all, because they had been taught this. Their minds were bended in the direction of political correctness is right, but more to the point is something that I've covered on my channel several times by listening to the podcast that came out of Marvel, wherein you had these people, these younger people, many of them in higher positions, editing positions, some vice president positions, others writers, saying the same thing over and over again, which was, and literally they used this phrase, fake it till you make it. Their attitude was that no one really knows how to do anything. It doesn't matter if you've been here for 50 years or more, you still don't know what you're doing, you're still faking it, so I'm going to fake it as well. Now, again, this might actually work if it was a merit-based system, wherein making it is actually having a track record of wins. But again, it's not about wins, it's about participation. So the whole fake it till you make it was channeled into actually faking it and not going any farther than faking it. And outside of this, just looking at industry in particular, what does faking it look like historically? Well, basically, you use buzzwords in order to make it look like you know what you're talking about. But the problem here is those buzzwords were the political correct words, which had a back end to it which cut off the idea of merit. Why? Because if you use politically correct words and someone called you on it, all you had to do was call them an istrophobe of one kind or another and get them to shut up. So basically, historically, you would be called on your BS eventually, and you would have to leave because you didn't know what you're doing, or make yourself better because you had to figure out what to do. But you didn't have to do that anymore because the buzzwords are political correct words, and I can call you an istrophobe to get you to shut up. Therefore, since anyone who criticizes the buzzwords can be silenced or gotten rid of very easily, there's no incentive to move past using buzzwords and just faking it the entire time. And as I said, this is what I would call the deep-seated political wall which the entire industry has hit because they can't produce anything new. Which again, we can see because of the fact that the top 10 shows on streaming services are older shows. Shows that were not produced by streaming services. No matter how much they produce, they still can't compete with something like Friends or Supernatural. At best, all they can do is take an old idea and try to revamp it for modern audiences. That's it. That's their entire playbook. Add into that some economic instability because of closing down the world for several years, and then on top of that, a writer's strike and actors' strike, which again asks for ridiculous things, which again I would say is a product of this participation culture mindset wherein they said, I know I haven't been working that long, but I still deserve as much as the guy who's been there for 50 years. No, you don't. So, long story short, is that the bust is now upon us. Most people simply haven't noticed it yet, and the streaming wars are over. Now, after all of that, how is this going to have a ripple effect on other kinds of entertainment and destroy what is basically the woke monoculture within entertainment that we have right now? Well, as I said, this is going to affect smaller industries first, which again, I would call the comic industry the smallest of these industries, and it's being affected right now, and it has been for the last couple of years, and it's going to ripple outwards towards other things like gaming and movies. I quite honestly think it's already hit Hollywood. But anyways, let's concentrate on what I have the most information on, which is the comic book industry. The point is that when this fire hose of money for streaming services just let loose, everyone within the comic industry decided to make not comics, but Netflix pitches for stories and just put them in comic form. Why? Because they were hoping to move up the ladder to actually have their story be produced as a streaming service show and then possibly move upwards towards movies. Why? Because they saw that's where the money was. They didn't care about comics. They were using comics to try to get a leg up into another industry, which is the industry where all the money was, which is the streaming services. And why they chose comic books was because there were some iconic symbols and iconic brands there that they could ride on the coattails of, supposedly, in order to produce these kinds of stories that would then be picked up. I'll get into that again in a couple of minutes. But first, let me give you a couple of examples of this exact thing that I'm talking about. Over the last year, about a year ago, I covered an interview that Frank Miller did with, if I remember correctly, the name is the School of Sequential Art, although it might have another name. But anyways, this school, based in New York, is considered basically the college system for if you want to be producing comics. Now, there are many other programs and many other universities, but this one is considered the cream of the crop. And it is where Marvel and DC would pull from. They would look at someone's resume and say, oh, you went there? Okay, that gives you a leg up. But the point is that within this interview with Frank Miller, which they just presented, you had someone from the school themselves introduce Frank Miller and Klaus Janson, who was basically interviewing him because Klaus Janson was his inker for a long time at Marvel and still does some things at Marvel. Anyways, the point is that when they introduced him, they said that the pattern of his life and his work should be the pattern of the people sitting in the seats who were enrolled within the school. What pattern is that? Well, he started off in comic books, then he moved into bigger and bigger stories that got picked up eventually by Hollywood and has become a spectacular success. That is what they are saying should be the pattern of how you produce comics and sequential art. Which, by the way, is supremely ironic. Why? Because, and Frank Miller himself pointed this out within the interview, the person historically with the most influence on that entire school was Will Eisner, and Will Eisner would say, no, you can't do that. Comics and movies and television, he would say, are two completely different things, two completely different mediums. You can't take comics and turn them into movies and television, although you can do so somewhat in the reverse direction. Quite honestly, just as a side note, I would say the only reason that Frank Miller was able to do this, because I ascribe to that statement by Will Eisner, is the fact that he didn't sell the stories, he sold stylization. And it was his stylization that he carried from comic books into different kinds of storytelling. It wasn't the sequential art itself. But anyway, the point is that the school itself, as presenters, we're saying, yeah, this is what you should be doing. When creating comics, you should be looking to upsell, not stay within comics, but move into television, move into movies. I also covered an interview with Kelly Sue DeConnick, the person who had created the current iteration of Captain Marvel that you see within the movies today. She did an interview, I think it was 2, 3 years ago, where she saw the writing on the wall and she was trying to plead basically with the streaming services, with Hollywood and television producers, saying, what you should do is hire all of us comic people and use comics simply as the testing ground of ideas so that they're the first draft of your show, of your movie. And oh, by the way, you should pay people like me, Kelly Sue DeConnick, a regular salary in order for us to produce comics, in order for us to do this for you. When she made that statement and I did a video on it, that was actually one of my best videos, watch-wise, that is. People definitely wanted to hear what she had to say because you had this woman who looked like an Oompa Loompa saying, yeah, I want to produce all of your science fiction and fantasy that you're going to see not just in comics, but in television and movies as well. I'll link that video in the description. But again, the point being that you had this person who could see that no, she didn't want to stay in comics. She wanted the money that was coming out of streaming services and of Hollywood. Another example of this would be one of the older, and at the time, larger indie companies, which was Valiant Comics. Valiant Comics was bought by a company which said, we're going to use this for the exact thing I just described. We're going to create pitches for what we want to be television shows and movies. That's simply what the entire line of comics is going to be moving forward. How did that work out for them? Well, I think Valiant Comics right now is on the verge of bankruptcy. And I certainly haven't heard anything of merit coming out of Valiant Comics for several years now. And a much more recent example of all of that occurred just over this last week. You had James Tynion, who is a writer. He produces some of his own stuff, but his claim to fame was that he wrote Batman for DC Comics, but he decided to give up writing a prestige character for DC Comics in order to open up his own company/initiative with several other people so that they could do this exact thing. Use comics as a first draft, basically a storyboard for television shows and movies. And he's certainly not the only one to do this. There have been a slew of them over the last couple of years. But the point is, he's a bit late to the party and finally realizing that no, you're not going to actually get that money by simply writing prestige characters for one of the cultural icons of comics, which is, again, Batman for DC Comics. Because this is exactly what these people were doing. They didn't care about comics. They didn't care about Marvel or DC. They didn't care about characters like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Thor. They didn't care. They simply wanted to use these characters, these prestige characters, characters that had ingrained themselves within pop culture psyche, as a stepping stone in order to try to get some of that money that was coming out of the fire hose within the streaming services. And there's no great mystery why they would think this way. This is exactly the thing that Bob Iger, the head of Disney, bought Marvel for to begin with, and bought also Pixar for, and bought Star Wars for. He states it within the interviews from 5-6 years ago at least, saying the reason why we're purchasing Marvel is so that we can leverage the brand recognition so that of all the entertainment that is deluging everyone all the time, they'll simply pick our entertainment because they recognize the brand. Those were his statements. That is the person in control of Disney, in control then of Marvel. That's the corporate mindset, and that's how these writers and producers of comics were operating. They're saying, we're going to leverage this character, which is recognized, in order to upsell to something else. But again, the point is that that upsell was theoretically possible because of the fire hose of money that was going through and into the streaming services. And again, they didn't have to produce anything of merit. Why? Because they're looking over at the streaming services of the young people in control of their political correct Gestapo that was in supreme control of how people actually communicated with each other. And they were looking there and saying, yeah, you don't need to have actual innovation, although this is one of the buzzwords they continually use, like diversity and inclusion and representation. Innovation is always there at the top of the buzzwords, but you don't need any actual new innovation. All you need is to use those politically correct buzzwords in order to create a form of entertainment that is going to, again, fit like hand in glove within the streaming services because that's what they're doing. That's how these younger people, given these positions of power, in order to spend all of this money, want. So, the conclusion of this entire thing is the fact that if the streaming wars are over, and really it looks like they're over, and the entire thing has now busted, A, the fire hose of money has simply stopped, which is causing the entire streaming industry to contract, which is causing massive layoffs, and only the people who can produce something of merit are being selected for those positions that are left. Then everyone who is using other kinds of media, like comic books, in order to try to get some of that money, their entire incentive is gone. And they're all going to start to realize, like James Tinian, that why in the world am I writing this so-called prestige character when I can't actually get to the ends that I want to, which is to work within Hollywood, to work within streaming shows. If I can't ride on the coattails of writing Batman in order to get that money, then I don't want to write Batman anymore. And at the end of the day, the point is that since these people were using different forms of entertainment media simply as a stepping stone to get to the place where the money was, and the money is no longer there, they no longer have a vested interest in controlling and dominating, basically, the smaller entertainment systems, or really even the smaller or bigger entertainment systems, doesn't matter. It could be comics wanting to become Netflix shows or movies coming out of Hollywood in order to change the entire thing into a subscription television show model within the various streaming services controlled by Hollywood. It doesn't matter. Since the money is now gone, and again, on top of that, the people being left there are the people who can actually produce something of merit, then the quote-unquote woke mind virus of these people, they're going to abandon these industries because they can't use them. Pure and simple. They can't use them, and therefore they're going to be left to, well, left in ruins, but still, left to the people who actually want to do things like produce comics because they like comics. Now, does that mean that Marvel and DC Comics are going to become great once again? I would say no. And I would say no because these new industries, these revitalized industries, which they're eventually going to become, are going to be based upon the opposite kinds of storytelling that you've seen for the last, well, at least 15 years within many of the entertainment systems, if not all of the entertainment systems that you get your entertainment from. Again, going back to comics, you would have to wipe the entire board clean for at least 20 years if you really want to get into what I think is the new forms of entertainment, which are going to emerge from this destruction or end of the streaming wars. Again, for a second, going back to the ideas of Will Eisner, he said that people respond to stories and consume stories because they present to the audience of society something that is severely lacking. And in my estimation, that something that is severely lacking within society, which is going to produce the new entertainment, is number one, manliness, number two, inspiration, and number three, morality. And I say morality is the biggest of those three. Why? Well, because it also has an economic factor baked into it as well. Over the last week, there was a tweet thread posted by Perch over on X, which sums up the entire comic industry right now. Marvel is producing a wedding issue of Mystique and Destiny, two female characters, by the way, and someone posted, "This is going to sell about 1,000 issues." And the reply to that was someone saying, "Why, does this book scare you?" And the reply to that was, "No, I'm just stating a fact that this is not going to do well. People don't want this anymore." And the reply again back from the same person originally who replied was the fact that, well, it really doesn't matter how much it sells because people are going to read it. All of us readers just simply read it for free on the internet, which is exactly the point of why the entire industry cannot sustain itself as it is right now. The people who support the ideological push within these books, they don't buy the books. I would say they don't read them either, but even if they do read them, this guy is claiming, well, we just read it on the internet for free. It doesn't matter. We're still going to consume it. Yeah, it does matter, because if you don't pay for it, it's not going to actually have an industry behind it that can produce stories anymore. And that's the point of why I concentrate on morality. Why? Because at the end of the day, if you're producing a product, why are you producing that product? You're producing it so someone buys it. And the only reason why someone is going to buy it, to give up their money, their hard-earned cash, which is basically their time, for your product, is because they specifically want to. And within today's internet-driven society, where you can find basically any form of entertainment, even the newest stuff, on the internet for free, the only reason why someone is going to willingly give you money when they could get it for free is because they have some kind of moral standard. They understand either that if I don't support this thing, then it's going to fail. And yes, I would say that is backed up by a moral standard. Or they would simply have the moral standard of, well, no, I'm not going to rip this off the internet for free because that's stealing. I have a moral standard of my own. I'm simply not going to do that. I'm going to pay for it. So the only reason to produce a product is so that people buy it. But the only people really that are going to buy entertainment in the future are the people that are willing to part with that money, even if they could get it for free. And that's because of morality. And therefore, that's the kind of story you're going to see in the future. Not only because morality is severely lacking within our society, but because that feeds an actual industry through the money that people are willing to give up. Add to that, of course, the severely lacking ideas of masculinity, again, which has an economic tie because men are more devoted to brands than women are, and of inspiration. And for my money, what are you going to get from those three things? We are going to get heroic-based stories, traditional heroic-based stories. That, I believe, is the future of entertainment, and that is a future that I simply can't wait to see. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and don't forget, there are 3 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, stories that center around the traditional ideas of a hero. So if that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.